All right, ready to dive into something kind of ancient, but, still relevant today.
Always.
The parable of the wicked vine dressers.
Ah,
This
yes.
is the one from the Gospel of Matthew, right?
Yeah.
That really got you thinking after you heard it at church.
It's a parable that's like puzzled people for centuries,
Ah,
It's like a spiritual riddle, but in a story.
yeah.
And it's really cool that you're, digging deeper into all the layers.
Yeah, and it sounds like your priest focused on individual sin and redemption,
Right.
which makes sense.
It's a classic interpretation for sure.
Yeah, it's a classic. But then you mentioned that one line, about the vine dressers wanting to kill the heir and then seize his inheritance.
Right.
And that really resonated with you in a different way.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, what was it about that image, that really struck you?
It's interesting because sometimes, like a single phrase, even just one
Yeah.
in a parable, can like unlock a whole new level of meaning. And to really like grasp the weight of that line, we really need to understand, the historical and social backdrop of where it's coming from. So this parable shows up in chapter 21 of Matthew. And by this point, things are already getting pretty heated between Jesus and the religious elite of the time, the Pharisees.
Okay, so picture this, right? First century Israel. Now, for those of us who aren't biblical scholars or anything,
Right.
give us the lowdown on who the Pharisees were and why they were, butting heads with Jesus.
Yeah, so think of the Pharisees, like the religious scholars and leaders of their day,
Okay.
highly respected, very influential, and they were known for their, strict interpretations of the law, both the written Torah and their own kind of oral traditions.
Mhm.
So they were all about upholding religious purity and their version of, how to live a righteous life.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Jesus comes along, and he's shaking things up,
Yeah.
you know, challenging their authority, questioning their interpretations, even calling them out for hypocrisy at times.
Yeah.
So you can imagine that didn't sit well with them.
No, not at all. Not one bit.
Not really their cup of tea.
Yeah, exactly. It's like that old saying, new sheriff in town.
Exactly.
So back to the parable itself.
Right.
We've got this vineyard owner, some, less than ideal workers, and this whole inheritance thing.
Yeah.
Break it down for us. What are the symbolic players in this story?
Yeah, so the vineyard is this like classic biblical metaphor, for Israel,
Mm.
or even more broadly, for all of creation.
Right. Yeah.
The world that was entrusted to humanity. The landowner, very clearly, represents God,
Okay.
the ultimate authority.
Right. Right.
Now, the vine dressers, they start out symbolizing the Israelites,
Okay.
who were entrusted with God's covenant,
Yeah.
right? That's like his sacred agreement with his people.
Yeah.
But their actions, especially, as we go along and they want to do away with the heir,
Mm.
it really shifts the focus to the Pharisees and their rejection of Jesus.
So that shielding line, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him and seize his inheritance.
Yeah.
We're talking about Jesus here, right? Yeah.
Exactly. God sends his son Jesus as the Messiah, the promised one.
Mm.
But vine dressers who, we're reading as kind of representing those who oppose Jesus, they see him as a threat to their power, their claim to what they think is rightfully theirs.
And this is where it gets even more interesting.
Yes.
Because you pointed out that this inheritance, it isn't just about physical stuff, right?
No, not at all. The source really digs into three levels of inheritance that the Pharisees might have been after.
Okay.
First, there's the inheritance of the scriptures.
Yeah.
The Pharisees really wanted to control how the holy texts, especially the prophecies about the Messiah, were understood.
Yeah.
They saw Jesus messing with their carefully constructed interpretations.
Which, given what you said about the Pharisees' emphasis on their own traditions,
Totally.
makes sense. Right.
They had a system, and Jesus was disrupting
He
it.
had a system. Yeah, they had a whole system. And, it's like that old saying, knowledge is power.
Right.
And the Pharisees, they really saw themselves as, the keepers of that knowledge. But then you have the second level of inheritance, the world itself. The source argues that, rejecting Jesus was also about rejecting his authority, right? His authority over the world.
So it's about wanting to keep their spot, right?
Yeah.
In the power structure, not just religious, but worldly power too.
Exactly.
It's a theme that we see over and over again in history.
Right, absolutely. It's timeless, And that brings us to the third and maybe the most, provocative level of inheritance the source identifies.
Right.
Divinity itself. Okay, now we're getting into some deep theological water here. What does the source mean by that?
So the source seems to suggest that by, and this is really interesting, by rejecting and ultimately, of course, killing Jesus, who is both Son and God, the Pharisees were, in their minds at least, aiming for a kind of, and this is a mouthful, ethnic divinity.
Wow. Ethnic divinity.
Yeah, it's like they were, how do I put this? Basically, setting themselves up in opposition to God, like claiming a unique spiritual authority, but based on, their lineage and their interpretations.
Ethnic divinity, that's a new one for me. Okay, so that's a bold claim to unpack.
It is.
And I want to make sure that, again, we're approaching this sensitively here.
Of course, yeah.
We're just trying to understand these interpretations.
Right.
We're not saying that, we endorse them or anything.
Yeah, we're just trying to understand the source's logic, however provocative it may be.
Yeah.
And this is where the source takes, I think, a fascinating turn, connecting this parable to the historical relationship between Christians and Jews.
Okay, before we get into that, which is obviously a very complicated and sensitive topic.
Right.
I think it's important for our listeners out there to remember that this is just one interpretation of this parable, right?
For sure.
There are a lot of different perspectives on this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Especially regarding historical events and, different religious groups.
For sure.
It's important to remember, we're dealing with layers on layers of interpretation.
Right.
Right. Interpretations of a parable, interpretations of history, and even interpretations of those interpretations.
Right. Layers on layers.
What we're aiming for here is understanding.
Right.
Not judgment.
Understanding, not judgment. Okay. I like that. So with that being said, what is this source's argument about this connection between, the parable and then this historical relationship between Christians and Jews?
Well, it seems like they're drawing a parallel, between the Vinedressers' rejection of the heir and what they see as a pattern of Jewish opposition to Christianity throughout history.
Okay.
They use the term replacement theology, which, in their view, argues that the church has superseded Israel as God's chosen people.
Okay, and they're connecting that back to the parable. How so?
Right, so they're seeing the Vinedressers' claim to the inheritance.
Yeah.
Their rejection of the true heir. It's like they see it as symbolic of this theological view.
Okay.
They're saying that this parable, maybe it reflects a deeper struggle over spiritual authority and legitimacy.
It's interesting because, even without getting into the specific theological debates and everything,
Right.
that struggle for authority, whether it's about religion or land or even resources or ideas, it seems like a recurring theme through all of history.
Oh, for sure. It's the same story, different chapter.
Yeah, exactly.
And the source, it's like they're saying this parable, with all the stuff about power, betrayal, and rejection, it gives us a framework for understanding these recurring patterns.
Okay, so I see what you're saying, but even if there are these, historical echoes, how does this parable or how does this source help us in our own lives today?
Right.
I mean, it's easy to get kind of lost in the historical weeds with all this.
Sure.
What are the takeaways here? What can we, use in our own lives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And what's fascinating to me is that even though this parable is rooted in a specific time and place, the core message, it's about power dynamics, hypocrisy, and then, the consequences of just clinging to control those resonate really deeply with the human experience. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. It's like that one line from Shakespeare, right? What's past is prologue.
Oh, I like that.
Even these ancient stories, they still have something to teach us about ourselves.
They do.
And about how we relate to, each other and the world around us.
It's like we're holding up a mirror,
Yeah.
to human nature in a way.
Totally.
Those temptations of power, those struggles for control, they're timeless.
Mm-hmm.
They're universal.
They really are. It makes you think, what are the vineyards, so to speak,
Right.
that we're tempted to claim as our own today, Where do we see those power dynamics, even in subtle ways, playing out in our own lives?
It's a question worth sitting with for a little bit, right?
Mm.
Because I think if we can at least recognize those patterns, those echoes of the past, but in the present, maybe we can make different choices. Maybe we can build healthier relationships.
Yeah, I like that. So we're wrapping up this deep dive here on the parable of the wicked vine dressers. What are some key takeaways for our listener? What can we glean, not just from, the parable itself, but, all these different interpretations of it too?
I think the biggest takeaway is recognizing that, parables, they're meant to be wrestled with.
Okay.
There's not like one right answer.
Right.
There's no single interpretation that's going to unlock all the secrets. It's about like engaging with the story, asking the questions and allowing it to, challenge what we think we know.
And in this case, it seems like we really need to, like, try to understand not just the parable itself, but all that historical and, what's the word I'm looking for? Theological,
Yeah.
like all that baggage that gets kind of attached to it.
The historical and theological baggage.
Mm.
That's a good way to put it. It's really about like understanding the context,
Yeah.
trying to understand the different layers of interpretation and approaching those interpretations with, some nuance
Mm-hmm.
and with respect.
For sure. Okay, so we've talked about power dynamics, different interpretations of scripture, even this idea of ethnic divinity, which, full disclosure, I'm still wrapping my head around a little bit.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
It's a lot. But ultimately, I feel like, the parable is really urging us to, you know what I mean? Like confront our own relationship with power and how that shapes not just our actions, but also like our beliefs, even our understanding of history itself.
Yeah, that's a really powerful insight. And I think it speaks to like what the source was talking about,
Hmm.
that emphasis on really trying to understand people's motivations,
Yeah.
even when we, might condemn the actions that came from them.
Right, because it's about, recognizing the humanity, right?
Totally.
In everyone.
Yeah, even in those that we might disagree with.
Exactly.
And maybe, just maybe, that kind of understanding, that willingness to kind of look beyond our own perspectives, maybe that's a step toward bridging some of those divides,
Mm-hmm.
towards finding some common ground, even when we're dealing with, really deeply rooted differences.
I love that. Finding common ground. That feels like a really important message, especially today.
For sure.
The world feels really, really polarized.
It does. It's very divided these days.
Yeah. And maybe, just maybe, this ancient parable, even with all of its, complexities and challenges and different interpretations and everything, maybe it can like offer a little bit of wisdom.
Yeah, a little guidance as we navigate these, really choppy waters, I guess, and,
Yeah.
and try to find that understanding
Exactly.
in a world that, frankly, really needs it.
I love that. Food for thought, everybody, as we all head back out into the world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, keep those minds curious and those conversations flowing.